So this video is about how to start reading philosophy. I believe that to begin reading philosophy, the journey is a bit similar to I want to learn mathematics on my own. It's a weird journey, and not many people know what to do with this. Because when you want to start reading Brandon Sanderson, for example, or you want to start reading fantasy, things are more obvious. You have this set of books that might make sense for you to read and that you might enjoy. And in philosophy, it isn't quite that obvious because what you're reading isn't that light, and it's not designed to be fun, but it is immense fun if you like it. And people will, similarly to Brandon Sanderson, they will tell you should read this and then you should read that, but that's a bad classification of what you should read and of what you should read, in my opinion, in philosophy, precisely because they will recommend for you to start with Plato, who is on his own quite inaccessible, because it's a very old author and he talks about very old topics which are very universal. Universal is probably the best word to describe this, but it's still not very. Maybe you want to read philosophy because you want to talk about current politics. Maybe you want to read philosophy because you saw a TV series on philosophy and you found it interesting and the topic might have been philosophical and you want to read more on that. You don't really start with Plato. And then the logical steps to follow would be you read Plato and then you read Aristotle and then you read the Hellenists maybe, and then you read at some point medieval philosophy, and essentially you read Saint Augustus, I think he's called in English, and then you read Saint Thomas Aquinas, etc. And you go on like this. And eventually you read stuff that is current, that is actual, that is contemporary. But the problem with doing all of this is it's not really that fun, I think. I mean, it doesn't sound quite attractive to do that. I mean, it's like saying maybe you're interested in reading, I don't know, theology. And they might recommend for you to read the whole Bible from start to finish. It might be too heavy. If you want to go closer to the notion of God and all of that, and not necessarily because you want to pertain to a cult or something, you just want to learn more about philosophy of God, which you might call theology, you don't really start necessarily by reading the Bible. So I once wrote an email to Noam Chomsky. Someone told me that he answers emails, and to be honest, in a very psychoanalytic manner, I will say to you, I wrote that email to Chomsky specifically because I felt lonely and I wanted an answer. And I felt that if someone famous answered me something specific I just asked, I would feel less lonely. And that did happen. I felt accomplished. And I remember I was 18, I think, or 19, and I wrote him this long email on all of the things that I liked, which was a way, I think, of saying, okay, I'm very interesting and you should get to know me more. And so these are my interests, and I definitely go in a direction that most people won't go, which, by the way, isn't true, because some of the things I was interested in were analytic philosophy, and that's it used to be very popular a short time ago, and now it still is being discussed about. It's just not that, it's not, it used to be more important, I would say, in the paradigm of philosophy. But the point is, I told him all of that, all of my likings and interests in philosophy, and I said, what should I read next? Or how should I begin? And his answer was very short. He just said, you should read what interests you. And something that was that was the thing he wrote. Along those lines was the thing he wrote. And I found it to be a good answer because someone famous who I respected answered to me in a topic that I very much enjoyed, philosophy. That was a dream made true. But it was also a very frustrating answer because he just said something very obvious to me. But that's true. And the whole video I'm doing, I think, represents that obvious truth. If you want to read something for fun in philosophy, you should probably go with your gut. And so I'm going to commit a sin here, speaking of theology, I'm going to commit a sin. But if you're interested in philosophy and you think that that has to do with self-help, then go on and read self-help. There are good self-help books that I can recommend. In fact, reading Jordan Peterson is a great way to go into this. You need to go in when you read Jordan Peterson, you need to be prepared mentally because it's going to be frustrating and it's going to be very fun because I think a lot of your views might change. But it's also weird because it's a bit right wing leaning, and it's essentially alternative right wing leaning, almost ideology. And it's definitely a self-help book, but it's a very interesting conjunction between pure self-help, which is generally plain and stupid, and philosophical content, because he mentions people like Ayn Rand and Heidegger and Husserl and Nietzsche and even Plato, I think, and he knows his stuff. And it's also a very interesting intersection between politics and psychology and philosophy. And on top of that, it's self-help, and it's quite clear to read, and it's quite accessible. It's also very abstract. I think it isn't that simple, but it's a good recommendation if you specifically want to start that way. And I say this specifically because that's the way I started reading more and more philosophy. I was interested in reading. I used to read books that explain philosophy to you in a very condensed way, with pictures and all of that. But at some point I wanted to read something more like a proper book, something thick and deeper. And I began reading Camus, for example, and stuff, but it was a bit too heavy for me. And I began reading Jordan Peterson just because I had seen him in memes, and he had something to do with Zizek in a debate he had, and I thought that was interesting. And this got me into more and more philosophy because after reading him, I read some of Zizek's work, I love Zizek's work essentially. And then I began reading Heidegger, and I began reading more about psychoanalysis, and I began reading Ignacio, which is an Argentinian psychoanalyst, and I began reading Ayn Rand, and I began reading Nietzsche directly, and I've now a book of Plato that I'm planning to read and stuff. But it gets you into this world. I think the commercial bit of it, the things that are right now fashionable, let's say, people are talking about certain things in the philosophical media world. So there are certain channels in YouTube like Alex O'Connor's channel, or there is this Richard Dawkins phenomena, or Jordan Peterson, etc. That's not real philosophy, in the sense of, well, you're not reading actual philosophy, and you're not listening to actual philosophers. You're listening to a biologist discuss something with a psychologist. People have compared the debate of Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins, the recent debate they had, with the debate of maybe Foucault and Chomsky. But that isn't the case. I mean, it's not the same. But it's a simulation of what you could get if you went deeper into this. It's a tiny bit of what you might get if you go more and more into this world. And I would recommend for you to go with what you feel you should read. And don't be afraid to go into things that people will tell you you shouldn't read. People will tell you shouldn't start with Nietzsche. And I would say the same, in fact, because it's much more enjoyable to know about Nietzsche if you know a bit about Plato before, because Nietzsche is essentially an answer to Plato at first. And in fact, to know a lot, Nietzsche it's a very elegant thinker, because to understand him, you must have known something about the general history of philosophy before, and that makes it very enjoyable and very nice. But then if you want to read that, then you should go with that. I think that's the way to start. And if you want to read about Marxism and psychoanalysis, the way I did it was I began reading Zizek. And of course, you should have read before Lacan and before probably Freud, etc. But I've learned a lot more on my own about all of these things, Hegel, Lacan, Freud, Kant, by reading just Zizek. And I know I should probably read the original authors, but then I get a very good notion of all of this just from reading Zizek. And even though it's just a notion, it's a decent enough notion, I think, because Zizek is actual philosophy. And what happens is I would probably not have read any of these if I hadn't given myself the permission to do this for fun. Because that's what I did. I read Zizek for fun. I wanted to learn something, etc., but it was always for my own eros, for my own pleasure. And if I had forced myself to read books in a certain consequence, in a certain coherent structure, and first I would have to read Plato and then Aristotle and stuff, I would have probably not done it. I would have stopped. I would have switched to fiction again soon. And so that's my biggest recommendation. You should follow your heart on what it is that you want to study in philosophy, what it is that you want to know. If you don't understand it, you shouldn't be too afraid of it. What I do, or what I did specifically, was I read and I read more. Like, it sounds stupid, but if you don't understand what you're reading, then you can research what you're reading, etc. But mostly what works is to go on reading. And at some point you get a notion of what they're trying to say, and you get this sort of macro idea, this meta idea that they're referring to, and then you refer to that in your own mind when you're reading this. And now you've understood it better than before, maybe. You still have a lot of doubts. It's very confusing still. But I promise you, the same as in BoJack Horseman, that famous quote from BoJack Horseman, it gets easier, but you have to do it every day. You have to go on reading. And I began reading specifically Zizek because I found him to be quite interesting, and he joined all of these things that I liked: psychoanalysis, politics, etc., Marxism, even mathematics. And at first he was very heavy for me, and he was not quite incomprehensible, but he was leaning towards that terrain of incomprehensibility. And I continued reading, and I related what I was reading to my own life, and I tried to focus on the macro and the meta idea. And then I had read The Sublime Object of Ideology. And my second book of his was Sex and the Failure of the Absolute, which I understood much better. And then I read, I think it's translated as The Harassment of Fantasies. And then I read How to Read Lacan. And I went on, and I've read like 7 of his books now. And now if I read him, it's still heavy for me, and I still have to focus to understand him more than I was if I was reading a novel, maybe. And some ideas, I at first think I've understood them, and then he says something and I realize that that's precisely the way I shouldn't be understanding that. He's very good at saying, okay, so this thing is happening, but you might think that it goes in this direction. Well, it doesn't. And he's always using these negations, these Hegelian negations of, well, it might be in this way, but it really isn't. And I really like that method, by the way. But then what I'm saying is, you don't get perfect at this. You don't become this guy who understands everything and all the time what you read in philosophy, but you become the guy that mostly understands it, that at some point has a structure of thought that is much better than what he used to have. And now it happens to me that when I explain stuff, I think the depth of what I'm saying is it's better, it's more, and it's more. I've become, I think, more qualified to say what I'm thinking, because I say it now more precisely and more exactly and more specifically than before, and I'm referring to deeper stuff than I used to. And that happens when you read philosophy. I mean, that's one of the things that happens. I think your whole linguistic structure reconfigures for the better. And it's also a fun process. And it becomes easier. And what you have to do is a very counterintuitive thing. You have to go on and read something that you're interested about, that you're interested in, and then you go on reading even though you don't understand everything. And if you still like the book, and if you are able to finish it, then you try and do that, and then you finish that book. And that's what you do. And so, good luck. I hope you enjoy your journey and read some interesting stuff.